So parallel processing really comes in handy with reverb, whether it's on vocals or drums, but I find especially on drums and vocals because these are instruments where you want to have control over the reverb. So normally what people do is they grab a reverb and, most plugins and even hardware devices have a mix knob. And that works just fine, but you have to understand that that's serial. So if you decided to, let's say, throw on, and I see a lot of people run into this issue, they try to compress after the reverb, you're compressing the sound of the reverb that you have used a mix knob for, but you're compressing it into the sound of the drums. So people a lot of times towards the end of their mixing stage find that their drums or their vocals become cloudy because after they've done bus compression and master bus compression, things get sort of murky. So you're losing control. In Ableton, what I do is I go here to audio effects, utilities, and the audio effect rack. And what this is going to do is actually work over that drum beat, having a dry chain, which is unaffected, and then having my reverb on its own spot. So I'll go drag and drop it in, and now I leave it at 100% wet there. So I have a dry lane and a reverb lane. So now I use these little faders here to control the balance of the two things. Turn it on. So it's going to sound slightly different. It's going to maintain some of the clarity, and I just have more control. And this especially comes in handy when you're also trying to be more in control of the sound. So, this is like a drum loop that has a kick, snare, hi-hat in it. Sending a kick through a reverb can be problematic, especially if it's a big subby kick, because low frequencies that go through reverbs can cause like phasing issues and can make your mix more muddy and actually obscure the kick drum, not really help it. So you can see here I'm putting an EQ before and or after I go into the reverb. I guess after I'll do in this case. So it goes to the reverb, but I filter it out of the ending reverb sound so I have more clarity. So you can see it's taking out those lows that are in the sound. And so you can hear there when I don't have the EQ on, there's more rumble on the bottom. Think of the sound like when you're in a car and you're on the highway and there's that kind of low sound, like air, basically. That's literally what a lot of times low frequencies sound like when they go through a reverb. Doesn't matter how nice the plugin or the piece of gear is, it's going to sound kind of muddy. And it's going to mess things up in the mix, so I filter it out on the reverb lane. Again, you can't do that if you're not doing parallel effects. And while we're talking about parallel processing, there's a lot of other things you can do. Like you could go in here, I could grab, let's say a delay. And what I'm going to do is use this as something that creates sort of ghost notes and extra syncopations in the drum loop. So immediately it's a really cool creative effect. And sometimes what I like to do on drums is actually use this as sort of a cool sort of ghost note generator. So I'll turn up the feedback. I'll go to something like tube tape, which is a little more lo-fi sounding. Make sure it's nice and wide. One side do dotted eighths and the other side do eighths. So you get these very cool syncopations. So here it is, the original drum beat. Now let's mix in some of those ghost notes. And the reverb. And you could take this even further. You could go in, grab something like a distortion and have a lane just for the distortion. So maybe I'll grab something like this. This is another classic from Sound Toys, Decapitator, and go to something like mid-driver. This is going to probably really boost the sort of crunch of the mid-range, especially in that snare. It sounds really severe and kind of like too much, right? But now what if I just decide to pull the fader all the way down and dial it in underneath the sound? So again, having a parallel lane gives you more control when you want to use some heavier saturation effects. So even though it seems like it's super low at -15, because if I A/B it, so you see how it added that extra little bit of crunch? I mean, it's small details like that that can really take a drum sound from just being something very basic in your loop and just creating something like way more interesting with it. And now we go to this. Now just staying on drums for a minute, because one of the questions I've seen people come up with is sort of confusion over why we use certain reverbs, or the fact that you can actually use more than one reverb, because reverbs can do different things. So when you're using parallel processing, you'll notice probably when you go into like a reverb that you use like a plugin, and you'll see some reverbs are very short and others are very long. Obviously the very long reverbs, like, it makes sense why they'd be long. It makes it sound like it's in a cathedral or a cave or something. But the really short reverb, some people ask me, they're like, what's the point of a really short reverb? I can barely hear it. I call those ambient reverbs. They're designed to kind of give you that sort of live sound. Like if you were hearing something, like when people sing in the bathroom, that's a very short reverb in the real world. And when you put this on drums, it actually helps sort of put them in an acoustic space, especially if those drums are really dry. So again, we go back to this loop. Now right here, I have a reverb that's under a second long. So I always think anything that's like 1.5 seconds or under, especially under 1 second, so this is 500 milliseconds or whatever, those are very good at giving you an ambient sound, which I find tends to brighten the sound and also make it more stereo. So if your drums are right up the middle, like your kick and your snare, when you add an ambient reverb, it's obviously going to be stereo. It's going to create more stereo field in the sound, which can be really useful in your mixes. So here I'm going to turn this on. Here's it dry. Now with the short. So you see how it kind of came alive, like it just had more going on in there. It was a little brighter. It just came more alive, right? So ambient reverbs are great for that. You can use two different kinds of reverbs. So here I've got another reverb, and you could see it's got 1.8 seconds. So this is sort of a plate reverb, and I've got this dialed in at sort of a lower amount. So it's kind of giving me the splash effect that we like in the longer decaying reverbs. So let's hear that. So you can hear the difference. One is making the drums sort of come alive, and the other is giving me that sort of splash effect. And you can see here I'm putting reverbs that go, or sorry, I'm putting EQs that go into the reverbs. So I'm blocking out the kick drum when I go the short reverb to avoid phase issues. And here I'm using another EQ that's shaped a little differently when it goes into the longer tail reverb, so I can get the right amount of bass going into that effect. And of course, with parallel processing, I just have more control over the sound. So here's the drums with two different kinds of reverbs. All right, so now we get to the part of the video where it's really about vocals, and using parallel processing, I think, is a secret weapon to better mixes and better vocal sounds, better vocal production in general. So I'm going to go here, grab the audio effect rack. Now, typically, again, what people do is they just grab a reverb and slap it onto their vocal. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but you are sort of obscuring the vocal when you use a plugin with just the mix knob.
You're always on my mind.
And that might be the sound that you're looking for. Like you might just put that on and be like, okay, I'm cool with that. There are some techniques with reverb when you use it with a parallel processing chain that give you a lot of control, like with the drums, but maybe in some ways that you might not expect. Like for instance, using ducking compression. So the idea with the vocal when you add a reverb is you're either trying to obscure it or give it dimension without obscuring it. So of course, putting it on a audio effect rack, you can change the balance between the dry and the wet signal. That's really good. But also, what if you just want the reverb to get out of the way while the singer is singing? You would actually use a compressor with an external sidechain. So this is where people, this is a really, really great technique. Everyone's doing this on professional mixes to make a pop vocal have a lot of reverb behind it, but not get obscured by that reverb. So what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing a compressor. You could do this with the Ableton compressor. You just have to set it to sidechain mode. So in this one, we go down, we hit external, and I'm going to receive it from the actual track it's on. So what you're going to see happen here on the graphic interface is we're going to duck out the reverb when the dry vocal is happening, and then it comes back in once we let go. So I'm going to go to auto release. And
you're always on my mind.
So you'll notice when she sings, the compressor is pushing down, taking away level from the reverb. And when she lets go, the reverb sort of swells back in.
You're always on my mind.
Now, without this compressor,
you're always on my mind.
The reverb is sort of blooming with her voice from the very first word she sings, which is not bad, but it may reduce clarity in the vocal. So this is actually what people are doing. And you don't necessarily even use auto release. You might make the release of your compressor time-based. So in other words, you might choose milliseconds based on the rhythmic timing of the song. So the compressor lets the reverb swell in according to the beat. That's another cool thing that's going to give the music this really nice unification, I guess you could call it. But yeah, that's a technique that a lot of people don't really know about. And with vocals, of course, just like drums, you could take this a lot further with other things. Like if I take, let's say, Echo Boy, and instead of using it for sort of a tape echo style effect like I was doing before, I might use it just for a slapback. So if I go here, just real quick, grab a preset, you can find, let's see here, vocals, and you can see you've got dirty slap, and that's basically just taking a 16th note and giving me that sort of,
you're always on my mind.
now that's really useful if you dial it in with the fader.
You're always on my mind.
To give the vocal even more sort of upfront dimension. And like everything else, right? I can go in, I can grab something to give it sort of a sense of distortion. So just go in.
You're always on my mind.
Super grating and like severe, right? But we dial it in underneath.
You're always on my mind. You're always on my mind.
So right there, I just dialed it underneath, gives her voice a little bit of edge, helps it stand out in the mix. If you go listen to a lot of pop tracks, you know, they're professionally mixed and recorded. A lot of times they're putting distortions dialed into the vocal sound because it just gives it like that nice sort of edge, a lot of cool saturation. Really like listen to vocals from pop records and try and hear if there's distortion in the voice. You might be surprised. It's not pristine sounding. They are putting distortion into that voice to help it stand out, give it a larger than life sound. So this is the real deal. Parallel processing is really important. You can do this in any other DAW. We just use audio effect racks in Ableton. So if you found this video useful at all, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more tips on music production. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Take care.